Hi, class. This is the lecture for the Euthyphro dilemma, and it's a little bit longer and extended. So, first of all, if you're a subscriber on my YouTube channel, you know there's a shorter uh, Euthyphro dilemma that might be fine for review, but that's really targeted for classes besides my ethics class. And so, if you're in the ethics class, we need to get into these things a little more deeply. Second of all, remember that the assignment before this video is to really poke around online until you have a pretty good understanding of divine command theory and the Euthyphro dilemma. So if you haven't done that yet, go do it because you might you might have trouble following the lecture otherwise. But that's also because there's not a specific reading involved. That's also why this lecture goes a little longer. So when we get into it, we're going to spend the whole lecture trying to understand one sentence. That sentence is that the Euthyphro question presents a dilemma to divine command theory. And so let's take those in reverse order. Remember, this is an ethics class, and so we're going to start with a theory of ethics that is divine command theory. And I'm going to keep saying it over and over again because there is a habit for students to try to make things into something that they're not. Divine command theory is a theory of metaethics. That is, it's not an account of religion. It's an account of where good comes from, what makes an act good. And when you understand it this way, the divine command theorist has a simple, really overly simple answer, that God's command is what makes any act right. So let's unpack this a little to make sure we understand this. This is a genetic account. This is saying where goodness comes from. What makes murder wrong? God said not to. What makes charity good? God said so. That's it. That's the whole story. That is the only definition or the only source for goodness if you're a divine command theorist. So let's talk about some of the things that don't commit you to divine command theory. Very common misunderstandings. So, if you believe there's a God, that doesn't commit you to divine command theory because you just told me something about metaphysics or religion, not ethics. If you think there's a God who is good, that doesn't commit you to divine command theory because, again, that's a theory of metaphysics or religion and not about ethics. If you say there is a God who is good and wants me to be good, same thing. If you say there is a God who is good, who wants me to be good, and commands me to be good, all of the things you just said are about metaphysics and or religion. None of the things you said are about ethics. And so even believing all those things does not commit you to divine command theory. What commits you to divine command theory is the addition. And what makes an act good is God said to do it. If you don't have that addition, you're not a divine command theorist. So, and really we should say the only thing that makes it good is God said to do it, or the only thing that makes it wrong is God said not to do it. Without those things, you're not a divine command theorist. And so this is not actually anywhere near as popular a view as you might have thought just hearing it, because people tend to equate being religious or believing in a good God with divine command theory when it's not. So, for instance, if somebody asks you, why is murdering children wrong? And you give an answer, and your answer is or says anything besides God said not to, you're not a divine command theorist. So it's a very narrow, very specific view about what makes an act right or wrong, but people just have this tendency to just kind of equate it with religion. So don't do that. Be very careful. But when we have defined the view in this way, we are able to come to the Euthyphro dilemma, which is not a general problem, but a very, very specific, highly structured problem for a very specific view, divine command theory. So the second thing to talk about, what specific structured problem are we talking about? A dilemma. Now, people mistakenly misuse this word a lot. Die means two. The only type of problem that is a dilemma is when you have exactly two options and you don't want to take either option. Either option is problematic in some way. That's the only thing that's a dilemma. So, if you want to go Hollywood, there's a very famous movie called Sophie's Choice, where she had the very unfortunate decision she had to make of which of her two children died in the Holocaust. That is a dilemma. There's two options, and she doesn't want to take either option. Or perhaps you've had this issue before. You're paying bills at the end of the month, and you only have enough money left to pay the gas or the electric. Well, your two options are pay the electric and not the gas, or pay the gas and not the electric. Therefore, either one comes with a problem. Those are dilemmas. Dilemma doesn't mean hard choice. It doesn't mean problem. It means very specific hard choice or very specific problem. Exactly two options. Neither option is desirable. Interestingly enough, if there's three options, it's called a trilemma. So, has to be exactly two. Two more clarifications that people misunderstand. Two problems with the same option is not a dilemma. So, I met a date of a good friend one time, and afterwards she asked if I liked him, and I said, well, no. And she said, oh, why not? And I said, well, he's kind of an idiot and kind of an a-hole. She's not choosing between the idiot and the a-hole. She gets both in the same package. So that's not a dilemma either. Has to be two problematic options, not just two problems. One more clarification example. And they both have to be problematic. If I said, okay, midterm grades, come to office hours, and you get a choice between an F in the course and an ice cream sundae, that's not a dilemma because there's obviously an unproblematic choice there. All right? So from now on, if you take nothing else in my course, please use the word dilemma correctly. So the Euthyphro question provides a dilemma to divine command theory. Now we need to talk about the Euthyphro question. The Euthyphro question comes out of the dialogue of the Euthyphro. So in the dialogue, they're trying to define piety, and they use God's plural because we're talking about Greek polytheism. But if we modify it slightly, the relevant Euthyphro question for our course is it good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? So, two options. Have we presented a dilemma yet? No, because to present a dilemma, you have to show that both of those options are a problem. But wait, a problem for who? Not for everybody, but for the divine command theorist. So let me say a few more things about before we get into why those two might be problems. One, the Euthyphro question, very generally, is a question you have to ask of anyone who tries to connect a God in ethics, who tries to connect a good God in ethics. So obviously, an atheist says no God, no problem. Someone who says that gods and ethics have nothing to do with each other, perhaps a classically positioned Shintoist, no problem. But if you say there's a good God and that God commands us to be good or to do good things, then of that person you must ask the Euthyphro question. And remember, if one of those options isn't a problem, it's not a dilemma. And it's like the ice cream sundae or F example. So the vast majority of philosophers, perhaps even all of them, will say, who believe in a good God, will just say, God commands it because it's good, no problem. We'll circle back to that in a bit, but instead we're going to focus on why it's a problem to take the first half and why the divine command theorist can't take the second half. So again, when I say halves, is it good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? For simple reference, these two options have historical names. The first option is called the voluntarist option. That is, what is good is entirely within God's free command. And the second option is called the intellectualist option because God commands for reasons. That is, the first option, it's good because God commands it. Goodness is a product of God's freedom. The second option, God commands it because it's good. The commands are a product of God's intellect. And so the voluntarist option, the intellectualist option. Notice I said a lot about freedom there. And we can, again, define divine command theory as goodness is what God freely commands. And it's worth drawing this out too, because we're going to see right away it causes some of the problems with the voluntarist option. For a command to be free means not hindered. So if I'm choosing between, I know it's going to sound blasphemous, but if a being, I'm not trying to equate myself with God, but if a being were choosing murder is wrong, murder is right, for that command to be free, I would have to be able to choose equally, that is 50-50, between one option or the other. So if all the weight of reason and logic and consistency is telling me to say murder is wrong, then the choice between murder and wrong and murder is right is not free. Put another way, the constraints and bounds of logic and good reasoning are actually an impediment on freedom in the sense we're talking about here. And so, for any command to be genuinely and truly free for God, it has to be 50-50. God could just as easily command one as the other. And then we start to see the problem a little bit. So, we're going to start kind of the formal presentation of why are both options, the intellectualist option and the voluntarist option, other order, why are those two options problematic for the divine command theorist? Both options have to be a problem for a dilemma. So, why is it a problem to say God? It is good because God commands it, i.e., take the voluntarist option? There's lots of problems, but I'm going to sort the types of problems under two headings. I'm not saying there's two problems. I'm saying there's two kinds of problems. And the reason I'm sorting them in this way is because the divine command theorist kind of has to deal with them differently. The first set of problems you might call problems of caprice or capriciousness. And all of these types of problems center around what the divine command theorist has to say, that God's commands are free and therefore arbitrary. That is, they have to be 50-50. They have to have no more deeper reasoning to them. They have to be a product of freedom rather than intellect. And all of these problems, and the reason why I'm using a sortal, because all of these problems have to be kind of treated the same way. One, you might find them counterintuitive, but they're just entailments of the divine command theorist view. So what does the divine command theorist have to do with these problematic entailments? Bite the bullet. They just have to accept, yep, that's part of my view. So what kind of problems are we talking about here? Start with the ones I've already hinted at. One, you have to say there's nothing more interesting to ethics. There's no principles to be reasoned out at all, because they're just whatever God says. Could just as easily murder is right as murder is wrong. There's nothing deeper or more intrinsically interesting to saying murder is wrong than saying God said not to. If that's not your view of ethics and how you think ethics should work, great. But then realize that means you're not a divine command theorist because you've rejected one of the entailments. Or, here's another one. If you want to say there's things wrong with murder besides God said not to, such as it causes pain, then you're not a divine command theorist. Because remember, the divine command theorist says the only thing that makes murder wrong is God said not to. 3, what's right and wrong could change. So if God's commands are truly unconstrained, that means they're unconstrained by consistency, which means God could just as easily, starting tomorrow, command that genocide is good and that we all ought to be doing it. If you say goodness is the kind of thing that doesn't change, or God's not the kind of thing that changes its mind, first of all, good. I'm glad you're saying that. But second of all, realize you've rejected an entailment of divine command theory, which means you're not a divine command theorist. Or speaking of how you depict your God, Leibniz had a particular problem with this view. Leibniz says, when we say God is good, that should be praise. But notice the divine command theorist view entails that it's not, because for the divine command theorist, God is good is definitionally true. Because whatever God says and whatever God does is good, and therefore, when you say God is good, you're saying that's true by definition rather than assigning praise. So, if you want to praise a God for being good, awesome, but realize you've rejected divine command theory. And so, these are all these kind of problems that just arise from, if I want to say there's anything to do with reasoning in ethics or reasoning in God, then you need to keep shopping for an ethical theory. Those are all problems, there's lots of them, that I've put under the heading of problems of caprice. But there's a whole second set of problems too. And these are all fall under a heading I like to call problems of knowledge. Because remember, divine command theory isn't just trying to tell us where goodness comes from. It's trying to present us with a view of ethics. That is, it's trying to present itself as a system of ethics. And a system of ethics needs to give you the philosophical apparatus to evaluate any act as right or wrong. And so what that means is, if I'm going to be a divine command theorist and say that's a satisfactory system of ethics, I need a clear, accurate, total presentation of God's commands with sufficient clarity that I can judge any act as right or wrong accurately, parentheses, without interpretation. We'll get to that. And problems of knowledge are just reasons to think we might not have that. So we'll get into the problems of knowledge in a second, but we can see why I divided into these two groups. Intellectualist problems just mean divine command theorist has to accept them. If you don't accept them, you're not a divine command theorist. Knowledge problems, by contrast, how do we know what God commands, have to be solved by the divine command theorist. So what kind of things are these problems? Well, in our introductory video, we learned that religion and ethics are separate. But if the divine command theorist is correct, they're really not, because we have to not only think there's a God, that's a metaphysical view, not a religious view, but also say God gave us a specific list of commands. The most common way to say this is an appeal to revealed texts. So, such as Judeo-Christian Bible, Hebrew Tanakh, Islamic Quran. I use these because these are the three most likely groups to be divine command theorists. So, the problems of knowledge aren't saying, well, it's not saying, well, why think that book is true at all? We don't need to go that far into it. But why think that these books are accurate enough to, are not accurate enough to do what we need to do? So remember, if we want to be divine command theorists, we need a total and precise list of God's commands to evaluate any action. There's some reasons to think that these texts don't do that. I'm going to give an example, and bear with me because you have 2,000 years of tradition you have to set aside. All right, so if I say, okay, you're a Christian, you say God speaks against abortion. Not all Christians say that, but if you do, someone might say, okay, well, open your Bible to the section that talks about abortion. And you know what happens if you do that? There is none. That word is not mentioned in the Judeo-Christian Bible at all. And you say, wait a minute, well, why are Christians so certain that their religion is against abortion? And you start talking about these things, and you tell a particular story that has to do with interpretation and extrapolation. And stop. I'm not saying those interpretations are bad, and I'm not saying they're good. I'm saying as soon as you say we have to interpret, you're actually not a divine command theorist anymore. Why? Reminder, divine command theorist says ethics are a product of God's commands, and those commands are free. But anytime you interpret, you actually deny that. Why? Take it in a couple of steps. If I'm interpreting, I have a basis for that interpretation. Whoa, mind blown. But stop and think about what that means. If I am interpreting, say, based on consistency. Well, God said this over here, so we could assume God means this over here. Okay. But if that interpretation is going to work, that assumes God's commands are consistent, which shouldn't be a problem, except you've just put a constraint on them. God has to command consistently, which, again, I love it if you do that, but you've just said, I'm not a divine command theorist, because I don't believe God's commands are free. I believe God's commands are constrained by consistency. And the same thing happens more commonly if you say reason. If you say, okay, well, this extrapolation is an analogy drawn from these texts. Good, that's inductive reasoning. But by making that assertion as a correct interpretation, you're now saying that God's commands are constrained by the rules of good inductive reasoning, which, again, fine if you say that, except you're not a divine command theorist anymore. So as soon as you say some texts have to be interpreted to figure out what God commands about them, fine if you say that, just realize that saying that removes you from divine command theory. Or to give a similar one, you could also talk about the ethical reinterpretations. There's this odd passage in what Christians call the Old Testament, that Jews call the Tanakh, where there is a situation where I believe it is Elijah is made fun of by a group of youths because he has his bald patch. Elijah cries out to God, who promptly sicks a pack of angry bears on the youths who are slaughtered by the bears. Now, of course, most people's knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, God is not encouraging us to murder people who make fun of bald spots. Instead, something else is going on. But notice the same thing happens as soon as you start interpreting the ethics of, say, those passages or some of the genocidal passages from the older people that the Hebrews were commanded to kill, or even New Testament ones where Jesus is whipping people and calling them vipers. As soon as you say, we have to interpret to pull the ethics out of that, one, I hope you say it. But two, realize that if you're a divine command theorist, you can't do that. So two of the knowledge problems are interpretation and kind of these questionable ethics passages. But there's a couple more as well. And notice these problems are not huge for if you're trying to read, say, the Quran as a holistic group, the holistic book that you're getting a general message out of. But if you're saying God's commands must be uninterpreted and very specific, then they create problems. So, I just mentioned the Quran. That's a bad example. Hebrew Tanakh Christian Bible need to be translated. Actually, Quran does not have this problem in the same way because the translation of the Quran is no longer the Quran. But if I am, say, looking at the Christian Bible, parts of it have to be translated from Biblical Hebrew, parts from Greek or Syro-Aramaic. And if you translate wrong, that might create an issue. So there's kind of this famous passage in Leviticus that says a man laying with another man is an abomination. Of course, that's from the King James translation, which goes from Greek to Latin to German to English. And the actual Hebrew word there that's translated as abomination means a more literal translation is outside of Hebrew culture. In fact, the same word is used to describe eating shrimp. So you say, okay, well, if I'm just trying to read and get a general message from the Bible, those kind of things aren't going to be a problem. Fine. But if you're trying to figure out exactly what God commands about eating shrimp or a man laying with another man, and you're not fluent in biblical Hebrew, you're going to have a problem. So, and part of this has to do with the more general issue of interpretation. Translators have to interpret. The word that gets translated as spirit a lot in the Hebrew Tanakh, the Christian Old Testament, literally translates as reins or kidneys. That's just because in their culture, it was a lot like when we say a lot of heart. It's not to be made literally, and so the translator made these changes to convey meaning. But anyway, if we're talking translation, you get a good translator and they're careful and they know their context, it's fine. But that's not necessarily something a divine command theorist can do, because again, you're relying on translation that we may or may not be appropriate interpretation that it may or may not be appropriate to accept. And then there's also issues of divine selection. At just about every major world religion, at least the ones you've heard of, there's some time where a group or council decides which texts are going into the holy books and which ones are being left out. And, well, how are those selections made? If you say, well, these people who are making these selections are scholars who have done their history and and therefore they're arriving at a good selection for what should go into the Talmud, or what should go into the New Testament. Well, okay. You've convinced me I at least have a chance of that text being correct. But again, if you're a divine command theorist, you are getting into layers of problems here because, what happens if something that actually has God's command was set aside or not included? You're once more leaning heavily on reasoning and interpretation, which the divine command theorist cannot do. And so the very notion of the first half of the Euthyphro dilemma, if you're taking the voluntarist action, you're setting aside any application of reasoning and logic and critical thinking, and you're taking that and excising it completely from ethics and honestly out of religion too. If you are not comfortable doing that, or if you are unable to do that because these texts seem like they have to be interpreted, then you're not a divine command theorist. All right, that was all a long-winded talk about just problems with option one, with the voluntarist option. That is, it's good because God commands it. So now, turn to the second option. God commands it because it is good. That is the intellectualist option. So, I alluded to this a while ago, but it's time to really emphasize it. Option B is not a problem for anyone except the divine command theorist. Because anybody who's comfortable saying the goodness comes from anywhere else, doesn't have to be outside of God, but outside of God's free choice, just says option B. So, St. Thomas Aquinas, obviously a religious person. Option B, what's the problem? Immanuel Kant, theist. Option B, what's the problem? Etc., etc. So let's talk about why most people can take that no problem, but the divine command theorist can't. Remember, option B just amounts to God commands for reasons. That's it. If you say God commands for reasons, you should be perfectly comfortable with option B. Divine command theorist denies that. So if we say God commands it because it is good, that word because is telling an explanatory story. There's reasons it's good. And if God commands because it's good, those reasons are before, at least in terms of order of knowing, God's command, which means God's command is not what made it good. The very fact that God commands for reasons means God's command isn't what made it good. And so the divine command theorist, and only the divine command theorist, can't take that option. So let's just go through a few examples. If you say, well, God commands these because God is a perfect intellect, and these are part of the rules of rationality and thought. That's basically what Kant says about ethics. Ethics is a product of reasoning. God is a good reasoner, a perfect reasoner. That's why God commands in this way. Great, that's a perfectly consistent story, and it means we could use reason to do all these wonderful things in ethics, but you're not a divine command theorist. If you say, well, torturing children is wrong because it causes harm, that means what makes it wrong is it causes harm. You've just described consequentialism, which we'll talk about in Unit 2. Great, but not a divine command theorist. But you don't even have to say that ethics is outside of God, only outside of God's command. So if you say, with Robert Merrihew Adams, well, God is essentially good, that is, the essence of God is the essence of goodness, then God's commands come from God's essence. Fine, but you're not free to break your essence. And so the divine command theorist is going to deny that story. And so the reason we're presenting divine command theory as a view basically to be set aside is if you want to say ever that we can use reasoning in ethics, you have to keep shopping. And of course, since the whole course is using reasoning in ethics, well, we have to start shopping right away. We have to start setting divine command theory aside. So let's bring it all together. Here is the Euthyphro dilemma, roughly and, well, quickly summarized. I'm going to take a deep breath. All right. The Euthyphro question presents a dilemma to divine command theory. If I'm answering that question or explaining that statement, I should say, what's going on? Well, first of all, divine command theory, you got to get this right because it's a very specific view. It's not a view of religion. It's a view of ethics. Divine command theory says, where does right and wrong come from? God's free command. That's it. End of story. Done. Anything that says goodness involves anything else, not a divine command theorist. So, what's a dilemma? A dilemma is when there's exactly two options. Neither option is one we want to take. The Euthyphro question presents such a scenario to divine command theorists. Why? The Euthyphro question, modernized, asks, is it good because God commands it? Intellectualist option. Does God command it because it is good? Sorry, I said it backwards. It's good because God commands it. Voluntarist option. Goodness is a product of God's freedom. Or does God command it because it is good? Intellectualist option. Commands are a product of God's intellect. Now, no God, no problem. But if you want to connect goodness to God's commands, it has to be one way or the other. Okay, why are both of those options a problem for the divine command theorist? Underline for the divine command theorist in your notes. Well, if we say something is good because God commands it, we take the voluntarist option. That's problematic in a whole slew of ways. We're talking dozens of problems. But we will sort them into two general headings. There's intellectualist option. There are problems of caprice that all center around, I want to say there's more to ethics than that. I want to say that making goodness arbitrary has some problems, and there are problems that there are entailments I want to reject. So if you want to say God is good as praise, not a divine command theorist. If you want to say there's more wrong to torturing children than God said not to, not a divine command theorist. If you want to say God commands the same thing yesterday and today, not a divine command theorist. If you want to say God is reasonable and that's why God commands, not a divine command theorist, etc. But there's this other set of problems called knowledge problems. Well, because divine command theory is being put forward as a system of ethics, which means it should give you the apparatus to correctly evaluate any action is right or wrong. And there's just some reasons to think that as we have them, we can't do this. The divine command theorist must appeal to sacred texts, but sacred texts must be interpreted which means we must constrain them by reasoning if we're going to get anything out of them, looking at things like context. They must be translated, and they must be read holistically rather than just a single passage, etc. And as soon as you start pulling the threads on that, divine command theory just doesn't work with the texts we have. They have to be interpreted, they have to be translated, they have to be read holistically. None of those claims are in any way controversial, but as soon as you say them, that just doesn't play nicely with saying God's commands are free and unconstrained by reason. All of those were problems with the first option, which means we have not presented a dilemma yet. It's no different than the boyfriend who's an idiot and with other problems. Well, all problems with the same option is not a dilemma. So we have to ask, why is it a problem to take the intellectualist option? Why is it a problem to say God commands it because it is good? This is much simpler to explain. The because does all the work there. If God commands for reasons, whatever those reasons are, reasons mean the command was not free, which means not a divine command theorist. And that's why the Euthyphro dilemma is a dilemma for divine command theorists and only divine command theorists. Anybody who's comfortable saying God commands for reasons or that ethics involves reasoning, anybody who says those things can comfortably take option B, no problem. So there's your answer. Let me say two more things, which is, why is this view always come up and why it's popular? Two reasons. One, people very often incorrectly believe that if they believe in a God or a good God, they have to be divine command theorists. As we've seen, that is absolutely false. As long as you think God commands for reasons, reasoning helps us in ethics. As long as you think God is good is not a definition, but praise, then reasoning helps us in religion too, by the way. Two, though, divine command theory is psychologically very soothing. It allows us to say other people are wrong without reflecting on our own views. And so in my world religions class, we sometimes talk about what makes a fundamentalist in the bad sense or an extremist. It's a combination of three things. Thing one, reading texts out of context. Thing two, reading text selectively, that is, say, paying attention to this sentence, but not this one over here. Thing three, pretending you're not doing thing one or thing two. You put all of those together, and you basically have God's divine license to do absolutely anything you want. You can get anything you want out of the text if you do those three things. And so there's this very kind of psychologically appealing, not only does it mean you don't have to do any work, you can believe anything you want is ethical, and you could look down on anybody you want, and you could feel superior to anybody you want. And so there's kind of these external, not good philosophical reasons why the view kind of remains popular. But in this course, we have to set it aside. If we want to reason about ethics, we have to keep shopping. And if you're anybody but a divine command theorist, learning more about ethics should enrich your religion if you're religious. So that's not a bad thing. But that's where we are with the Euthyphro dilemma. If you want, here's a couple of good discussion questions. If you want to post them in the discussion boards. One, what seems to be the biggest problem and why? Would be a good discussion board question to answer. Two, what's the role of reasoning in ethics? Might be good to talk about. But then also, the Euthyphro dilemma is very hard, but it has to be structured right to be an objection the way we want it to. Which means, remember, summaries don't get you credit, but if you want to start this week's discussion by posting a summary or putting the Euthyphro dilemma in your own words, that would be a really helpful exercise. I'll look at it for accuracy, but again, summaries don't actually get you credit. So keep working at it and post questions as needed.